Hello and welcome to the Heartbound Editing Podcast. This is episode 33 of the weekly Story Savvy series, where we tackle the 52 biggest self editing topics and tips to help you make your good story great. As a published author asks me, a developmental editor, all of the questions that you have wanted to. My usual co host Agnes and I have covered a bunch in this series so far. And last week, Addy and I went over the aspects of intangible world building to check in our stories. Today, we are going to finish out this topic by talking about tangible world building. By the end of this episode, you'll all hopefully feel confident identifying where you might want to change or tweak parts of your tangible world building and have a good idea of how to do so intentionally and creatively. Joining me to ask all of the questions is my friend, former critique partner, and author of One Season with the Duke, which I had a great time critiquing and giving feedback on, and the Troublemakers trilogy, the third book of which is coming out in September, so just next month. Welcome, Addy DuLac. Hello. Why don't you tell us
Hi.
a little bit about you and your writing, whatever you feel like mentioning, before we dive in with our questions here?
So a little about me. In case you were unaware, I'm Addy DuLac. I primarily write interracial historical romance. I've released three books between my two publishers. My first novel with Entangled was the aforementioned One Season with the Duke. It won three Emma Awards for Best Novel, Best Debut, and Best Interracial Romance.
Congratulations.
Um, Thank you. That was a weird experience, but I was excited about it. My first trilogy, called The Troublemakers, is being released with Dragon Blade Publishing. It features three heroines from diverse backgrounds. One is Chinese, one is South Asian, and third is from the Caribbean. And they're equally rebellious male leads taking on racial, familial, and social tensions while they fight for their right to love, live, and thrive in Victorian England. Not an easy task. I love drama. I love angst and steam when I'm writing and when I'm reading. My favorite primary tropes are arranged marriage, marriage of convenience, and adversaries slash enemies to lovers. I also like mixing these things. There's nothing better to me than a marriage of convenience with enemies to lovers. Like that is my catnip. That's perfect.
Love
Um,
it.
Tara, I'm taking. I won't take it back. I love Zatara. Okay, so moving swiftly on. I write in third person dual mainly. Sometimes I dabble with triple POV, and mostly because it's my favorite to read and therefore to write. My fourth novel, the last in my Troublemakers trilogy, is due for release in September, as Rebecca stated. It is called Miss Hawthorne's Unlikely Husband, and it follows Miss Elodia Hawthorne and the challenges she takes on to marry the man she's loved since she was 15 years old. So, look up for that.
Yes, can't wait.
So, last week we went through intangible world building. Since I asked you last week to define intangible world building, could you also define tangible?
Sure. So, tangible is anything that you can touch, essentially. Very, very basic there. So, that can be the clothing, which is my niche. So, I tend to overemphasize that a little bit, but it can really make a big difference on how the characters move through their world and present themselves and all that kind of thing. Tangible world building is also horses and transportation, geography and maps, buildings and architecture, money and other means of exchange, food and drink, means of communication. So, reading and writing, if they have telegram systems, anything like that, and so many other aspects like that. Laws, government, and religious rules are sort of this murky gray area between tangible and intangible. So I'll just mention that again here since I think I only mentioned the religious aspects last
Mm-hmm.
week.
Yeah. In book one of the Troublemakers, laws became very tricky for me because I had a sort of a Gretna Green elopement situation.
Okay.
And unbeknownst to a good amount of most people, when they're reading historical romance, they read it in Regency, where you could just pop over to Gretna Green and then come back. But because I decided to be difficult, I did it in Victorian England, and apparently, in not apparently, but in I think it was like 1839, no 1849 or 59. It's later on. I think it's 59. They changed the law so
Ah,
that like if you went to Gretna Green but you didn't if you went to Gretna Green you had to stay in Scotland and be a resident of Scotland for I think 2 to 3 weeks before your marriage would be considered like a real thing, so you couldn't just pop over anymore.
that still doesn't seem very long, but yeah, that's a great
it's not
example
it's
of
not that
this
long, but when
this
you're
is
trying
world
to
building that's relevant and you need to pay
yeah.
attention.
Yeah, because you think that like, but think about it. Like, if say you run away to Gretna Green with your boyfriend, right? 3 weeks. It's not a long period of time, but it's a long period of time for you to avoid detection from your
Sure.
parents. Because even if you consummate your marriage, it is not considered legally binding unless you've been there for 2, 3 weeks, which means that your parents can still drag you back. It can still be annulled. You still have problems. And now you're deflowered on top of it. So now it's like a whole situation, right?
Yep.
But it's before it was just like as long as you were knocked up, you were good. Like as long as, So that's one of those situations where you're just like know what
Law
them
of
laws are
movies.
at the time
Yep.
because that could screw up your whole plot,
Yep.
case in point. So, was there a reason you felt like it was important to cover intangible world building before tangible world building? I feel like when most people think about world building, they think of either or both together or just the tangible side of things.
Yeah, and that's largely the reason.
Oh,
So with I basically think that it's better to deal with the harder, newer, perhaps more cognitive dissonance, expanding your brain functioning aspects first. And especially since those are going to have the bigger impact. So if you're
mhm,
looking at these intangibles and religion and mindset and belief and all of these kind of things, that's going to take more effort. So getting the hard stuff out of the way and then doing the nice, quick, and relatively easy aspects of the
mhm,
tangible
mhm,
tends to work better for the authors that I've helped through this process. And then related to that, it's also better to change what intangible things you need to before you polish off the tangible because it's more likely that intangible changes or needed changes are going to have a big effect and change the tangible than the other way around. If
right.
you decide that you need to set your story in a place that has a completely different mindset or set of laws, like we were just talking about, that's a big change. And if you've already put in the work of polishing the tangible world building for the wrong time and place, you've wasted
Hmm.
that time. So
Yeah.
making the decision on the intangibles first is basically all around the smarter way to go. And then once you've locked that in and done those edits, then going in and polishing those tangible aspects.
Hmm. So, how can we strike a balance in presenting our tangible world building between giving enough detail that readers can feel immersed, but not so much that they get bored or distracted?
As always, like I
Mhm,
mentioned in the last episode, make sure that you mention things and ideally show them, as the mention, just in time rather than just in case.
mhm,
So mention it in the moment where the reader needs to know it, where it becomes really, really important to know, instead of 5 chapters earlier, just in case they need to know it later, or just in case they'll remember
it
it
comes up.
later when
Yeah.
yeah, so
Yeah.
just in time, not just in case every single time.
Yeah.
It's it's also just important to remember what I was talking about earlier, I think it was 2 episodes ago with scene stagnation. Look at those markers, look at those, proportions that we talked about there, and make sure that on a scene level basis, on a page by page basis, you're not falling into either dialogue stagnation, description stagnation, or just everything happening with no description or dialogue stagnation. That's really, really what we're watching for here. If you have a really slow paced scene where you're worried about that balance being off between your tangible world building and other things, you can also just look at adding more things that are happening on the surface while you're building that background stuff in the background. The really, really important word there is happening.
What if in self-editing we realize we need to go back to the drawing board and designing or clarifying the tangible world for our story? What are some questions listeners can ask themselves as they explore their worlds with more depth?
Sure. So the same as before, really, but for this, I suggest that you start with what do you need your world to do if your world building was perfect? What service would it be doing? What purpose would it have? What would it be doing? And then ask yourself, how could your world building choices better tie into your theme and your stakes and your genre and all of these things that I've talked about in previous episodes? Once you've asked yourself those two questions and come up with answers that you're satisfied with, then go through that other list that I mentioned and try to match that ideal before applying the changes that you decide you need.
Mhm. So how can I make sure that I have the right setting choices for the overall book and for each individual scene?
The main question here is, does it impact the scene
Oh,
in any way to start with, and then in a good way, and then in a meaningful way? So when you're checking this, just look at if it is giving you more to work with. Is your tangible setting choice giving you more to do, more to explore, more to overcome, things like that? You can also check if it creates or furthers goals, motives, or conflicts. If your setting choices, let's say, help your character get closer to their goal or reminds them of their goal or brings up old motivations that they're trying to get away from, or the setting itself creates conflict, that's a good indicator that it's the right choice. Does the setting choice complicate things? This is very much connected to that idea of conflict. Does it create hurdles that need to be overcome? And then, lastly, on my little list of questions to ask yourself here is, does it add to the tone or immersion? And sometimes this choice looks like picking a new setting that you haven't used before instead of reusing an old one, or picking a setting that is more tonally on point for that moment. So, for example, instead of having your lovers have their breakup scene at home, because you've already done 4 scenes there, have them do it at a theater as everyone's leaving at the end of the play. Those are going to really impact the tone of the argument because of the witnesses and because of the setting. And it is going to impact the immersion because having it happen in a much more involved setting is going to get your reader more pulled into the experience of that scene.
what are some of the most forgotten aspects of tangible world building, in your opinion?
I would say my one answer here, honestly, that applies to a bunch of different stuff is that authors forget that you can use all of the aspects of tangible world building, not just include them. So instead of just mentioning that horses are used, use that. Have a horse buck and the protagonist falls off and then they have to walk home because the horse ran off. Have the horse step on a caltrop and so the carriage has to pull over and they can't go further. Have have a silly moment where horse gas absolutely interrupts a flirtatious or otherwise serious moment.
Yeah, yeah,
Use these tangible things. And like for clothing, don't just mention that she's wearing a ball gown. Have her get stuck trying to get out of a carriage. Have
yeah.
the train get muddy and this brings her social shame. All of these different aspects of tangible world building can just be included, but it's going to mean so much more and be so much more memorable and immersive if you use them.
Mhm. Is that sort of like, I guess when you're setting the scene, but it's sort of like the showing, not telling? sort of situation. Because it seems like that's the difference. Instead of just saying like, "Hey, we have horses here," it's like great, but like you can sort of interweave. Is that the conjugation? I can spell. Is that you can sort of you can thread them into it, and then they know that they're there, rather than just being like, "We use horses as a being choice of transportation." It's like, well, if everybody's using the horse,
So
right?
there's overlap there. And
Hmm.
yes, I highly recommend always showing rather than telling, especially around world building. But what I mean here is specifically there's a branch in two different directions the story could go.
Mm.
One in which this tangible world building thing doesn't exist, and one in which it does. So when your protagonist goes to the ball and she's in her big hoop skirts, there's one version of that scene in which she doesn't step in the mud puddle and get her dress muddy. And the reactions that she gets, the way that she feels about her own confidence is very different than when she does step in that mud puddle and her beautiful silk dress that she just spent pretty much all of her money on gets muddy and stained. And
Mhm.
so she then spends the whole ball in this very different direction. So when I
Okay.
talk about using these, what I mean is use them in a way that forces that story to branch from where it otherwise would have gone
Ah,
instead of just having the horses pulling the cart. So the protagonist gets home on time and goes to bed and things go from there. Instead, the horse steps on a big rock and gets lame, and the cart pulls over, and they're delayed by several hours while they get the stone out and calm down the horse and all of this kind of stuff. So when she gets home, her parents are angry and think that she was off with a guy, which is why she's late, and the story has a different direction.
yeah,
So when I'm talking about using things and making them matter, it's those little branching moments. Don't just
yeah.
show them changing how the story moves forward at some scale.
Okay. So it's like if like sliding doors sort of like it's like so say like she normally would walk home, but her friend offers her a carriage, so she's able to take the carriage home, and now she catches her husband in an affair kind of
Yes.
situation. There you go.
Yeah. Glad you asked
It's all
that.
coming together. Yeah. So what are some of the biggest mistakes that you see authors do when building a world, especially in historical or fantasy?
Yeah. First of all, they don't care enough about that aspect. I've read quite a few books where the author was very character centric or plot centric and they very much let the world building happen as an accidental afterthought to the plot or the characters. You as an author, this is an important aspect to think about, especially in the self-editing. It's fine if you don't think about it too much in the planning or the drafting, but there's a reason we're doing two whole episodes on it in this series. You need to give it thought because it really does have an impact and it really does affect how the reader experiences the book, but then more than that, remembers the book and feels a part of that world, like we talked about in the last episode in fandoms. World building has a lot to do with how people become fans, and you want fans after the fact. Another common mistake that I'll see is that they never consider the intangible repercussions of the tangible aspects. So, at the highest scale, this can be they pick the 1860s because they love hoop skirts, and I get it, I do too. But they don't then consider the social ramifications, cultural ramifications, the rights and rules and laws of that decade in whatever part of the world they decide to place the story. When you make a tangible choice, let's say such as your world having minted coinage to purchase things with, that has intangible repercussions about how people view, in this example, labor and exchange and wealth and legacy, all of these kind of things. You need to consider the repercussions. And then the third most common mistake that I will see is that they simply reach for convenience too often. And this, I totally get not wanting to dwell on the nastier aspects of historical settings or
Yeah.
modern ones for that matter. You really almost never need to describe a character using the bathroom. But if it becomes unavoidably relevant, don't throw away the general or specific world building that you've done in the name of convenience, either for you as the author or for your protagonist. When things aren't convenient, that's what's interesting to read in novels. So if your character needs to get from point A to point B and you live in a world where horses are the best transportation, they need to take a horse. You can't magically invent trains in your world for this one
Right.
transportation. So when you hit a snag in your world building and you're tempted to reach for, or you notice that you did this in drafting, you're tempted to reach for that convenience, consider not doing that. Consider letting it be more accurate, historically accurate, and show that darker side, show that inconvenience, whatever that happens to be.
Like, that's kinda like what you were saying, by using the inconvenience to shape the plot, right?
Yeah.
So, how can we make sure that our world building is logical and consistent when throughout?
I touched on this a little bit in the last episode, and it really comes down to make those world statements like your world as a character. Make statements like, okay, it's set in this rough time period and this location. And again, this applies to modern. I'm talking about it a lot in the historical and fantasy context, but even if you're writing contemporary, this can matter.
Mhm,
And make statements like, oh, and I also wanted to mention this can apply to simply the protagonist's interpretation of their world.
mm,
So, through your protagonist's worldview, the world can be a dark and dangerous place, or it can be a bright and beautiful place full of opportunity. Make those statements about how your world exists objectively, but it can also be really helpful to make statements about how your protagonist views it objectively. Sorry, no, other
mhm,
way around. But anyway, you get the point. So it's not just about how it is, but also how it is perceived. So
mhm,
beyond making those statements and going back to them, referring to them, putting them in your series Bible, knowing where to find them, I also suggest that as you're reading through your book, if you see something that you wrote in drafting and you're like, oh, that counts as world building, copy and paste that into your series Bible. If this doesn't have to always be you coming up with ideas and then going and applying them, you can see what you already did or what you even subconsciously did without realizing. But
mhm.
the point is, you need to collect them so that you can use it as a reference point. So when you're reading through, collect those and start building out that series Bible more.
I know we need to, wrap up, but I have one more question for you. Are there any specific aspects of tangible world building, such as clothing or horses? Since that seems to be the consistent thing, which I know are your specialties, would which you'd suggest authors watch for in self-editing, or that
Yeah.
you have specific advice on?
So many different topics.
Ah!
So when I'm editing, this often comes down to what that individual author needs. I don't have a standardized template of any kind when I'm doing developmental edits because every story is very different and every story has very different needs. So, just off the top of my head, some of those have been one person really needed help with geography,
Mm,
and I ended up talking through them after the fact in our debrief and emails, just figuring out, okay, what does this city look like? Because I know there's a harbor and I know there's a cliff that overlooks it, but the two don't seem to line up in any kind of logical way from what you've described. Clothing is a common one, but again, that's one of my specialties, and I'll have particularly historical writers contract me just to do fact checking on the clothing. So for the clothing, I recommend either staying very vague. So just say a dress and an underdress or a
mm,
shirt and trousers, or do your research and use the right terms. Make sure that you're using the right layers, the right structure. I think it was the last episode we were talking about how corsets are really important as an exoskeleton to hang all of those heavy skirts on.
yeah, they're
So
foundational garment. They're not just there to,
yes.
yeah,
Yeah, it's not always just fashion. A lot of it has to do with a
function.
system of clothing. Yeah,
Mhm,
for functionality, and this piece only exists because this other one is always worn kind of thing. So do a little bit of research. If you're writing historical and like talking about clothing, hire an expert. It doesn't have to be
mhm.
me, but please have someone check it to make sure that it's right.
Yeah,
Horses are a really common one. I'm in a lot of different writer and reader groups, and horses is probably the topic that I see talked about the most as far as getting that world building right. And I will also say here that if you decide to come up with a fantasy version of horses, which I see regularly in high fantasy, you still need to make similar decisions about what is, let's say, giant moose that you can ride. What is their psychology like? What is that training process? Can you ride them? Can they only pull carts? What does that harness look like? Do you need to steer the horns? Is it a bit in the mouth? Think about these things.
Mhm.
Um, yeah, just pretty much any topic I can have specific recommendations about. So
Yeah.
if anyone listening to this has a specific topic that they in the tangible world building that they want advice on, email me. My email is all over my website. You can find that. And that might be anything from cities versus towns versus farms and the considerations about that. It could be dates and telling time. It could be how people communicate when they're not in person. The last thing that I really, really, really want to talk about here is weather. Weather is a big intangible part of the world building that I don't think gets used enough. And
Mhm.
we talked about this a minute ago, and I'm so glad you had me define that further, but use the weather. Use a bright sunny day to force the protagonist to find shade or to survive in the desert
Mhm.
a shorter amount of time. Use a storm to force your protagonist to seek shelter, to step in a mud puddle,
Mhm.
to need to get a carriage instead of riding their horse. Use your weather choices. It's amazing the difference that
Mhm.
a foggy day and a clear day can have on the tone of the scene
Mhm.
and how it goes, and it affects the protagonist's mindset and their choices and all of that kind of stuff. So please
Mhm.
don't forget weather as part of your tangible world building.
Oh yeah, because every time I think of weather, I think of like forced proximity. And
Sure, yeah.
it's just like you want to go further, but I guess you're just going to be stuck with your crush under this tree because there's a rainstorm. And if the
Yes.
storm gets particularly bad, you may need to stop by the woodcutter's, by the what do you call it, the groundsman's cottage, and just hang out there for a bit and hope that nobody notices, and you don't have to have a marriage of convenience because all kind like the amount of like times like historical romance is absolutely just like weather. It's like what? Oh, it was a snowstorm. Y'all about to fuck for 3 days straight. Three.
Yes.
Because you
Yes.
can hold up for the first half of the first day, and after that it's to the races, right? Like
Or
after that it's
it can
over.
affect your stakes. Like maybe you get
Yeah,
stuck out in that blizzard and you're
right.
on the cusp of death and that woodsman comes and rescues you and you have to
Thank God
spend
for
a week
that.
recovering. And yeah.
Right. What are you gonna do? He can't just take you home. You're dying, right?
Yes.
But I also think of like horses, like going random things, like when you're on a journey and you're going off. Like I keep thinking of Lisa Kleypas's The Devil in Winter, where you had that issue. I don't know if you ever read that one, but it's a book where in the beginning you have the heiress escaping with this scoundrel that she specifically sort of like hunted down and conscripted to like marry her because she's trying to escape her family, and she like it's I think it's like I think it's about one or two chapters of the journey from London to Gretna Green, and she's very careful about like what is the reality of a jaunt to Gretna Green. What does it feel like? And you get into weather. It's cold. It's getting colder and colder the further north you go. These horses have to stop every 30 miles to switch out. What does that feel like? These these carriages are not like it's the best carriage money can buy, but it's still a damn carriage. And you like and you know and like after like 12 hours of bouncing around and stopping, and it's in the middle of the night and it's all kinds of stuff. You're tired, you're hungry, you're achy, you're cold, you're running out of all this stuff, and like you can't fall asleep yet because when you get to Gretna, you need to get married immediately. And it's just like the wear that it has on the characters, and you're just like, it makes you really think about if you trying to escape to Gretna Green, like how badly do you need to marry this person? Because this is about to be the most uncomfortable night of your damn life. And that's your best case scenario, right? Like even with because he's a viscount, but he's the son of a duke. So like the stuff that he has at his disposal is like the best of the best. Like he has the food, he has everything. and the best out of the best leaves you ragged at the end. Okay.
Because that's all tangible world building, and when it's
Yeah.
historical, you have really clear bumpers
Yeah.
on how uncomfortable and unpleasant and wet and cold and chafing you're
Right.
gonna be.
And gross. And then, but to think about the character, but also as you're doing that, you it forces or it allows you to build a certain sense of like either emotional closeness or physical closeness between the two characters because now even though they started off and she was just like get in here so get in here dance burger boy like now it's like no I need you to take care of me and he's like I know I'm here I'm also tired like kind of situation like that kind of stuff and you're like no wonder like and so like it helps to like set the stage of like
Yeah.
the person that you're dealing with as well. It's good for character development and it's good stuff. Okay, this has been so much fun.
I'm
Yeah.
glad to hear it. I love
Yeah.
chatting with you, and I love your clarifying questions and the examples and everything like that. So again, thank you so much for stepping in as a guest host
No
on this show.
problem.
It's really a
No
pleasure.
problem. Yeah.
Next week, I will be getting into the first of 2 episodes on sensory immersion, so related, starting with science, sights, and sounds. For now, huge thank you to everyone who follows along with this series. Yeah, if you haven't liked and subscribed yet, please do. We would really appreciate that. Both the Heartbound Editing podcast and the Authors Alcove podcast. You can find lots more content beyond this joint series in both of those places. And then lastly, I highly encourage you all to go check out Addy DuLac's awesome interracial historical romance novels at addydulacauthor.net. That is ADDYDULACAUTHOR.net. And to follow her on Facebook, TikTok, and Instagram at AddieDuLac_author. And definitely keep an eye out for her next book in September. Thank you so much for listening to the Heartbound Editing Podcast. I look forward to bringing you more content to help you make your good story great so it can change lives and change your world. Follow along to hear more, or visit my website linked in the description to learn how I can help you and your story to flourish. See you next time.